The moment the judge signed the order, my heart shattered into a million cold pieces. There, in the courtroom of downtown Chicago, my own daughter sat with a smile, watching as they handed over the last key to the house I spent decades building. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Helen Margaret O'Connor, and I am 73 years old. For the past 5 years, I've been living in the same brownstone on Chicago's North Side, where I raised my children, where I built what I thought was a loving family. The house sits on a quiet street lined with maple trees, their leaves now golden in the October light. From my kitchen window, I can see the corner where the old Italian bakery used to be, now replaced by a trendy coffee shop that charges $5 for what used to cost 50 cents. Every morning, I woke to the brittle city sounds outside my window. The distant rumble of the L train carrying thousands of strangers to their daily lives, the rumbling buses belching diesel exhaust, the aroma of fresh espresso from the corner cafe mingling with the crisp Chicago breeze that cuts through the concrete canyons of this city I've called home for half a century. But inside my home, a warm brownstone filled with faded family photos and the scent of lavender potpourri I refresh every Sunday, there was an exhausting loneliness that clung to me like a shadow that grows longer as the sun sets. The walls of my living room are covered with photographs spanning 40 years. There's Allison at her high school graduation, her smile bright and genuine, her arm linked through mine. There's my ex-husband Robert, his hair still thick and dark, holding our newborn grandson Tommy. There's Christmas morning from 5 years ago, the last time we were all together. Everyone gathered around the tree I decorated with ornaments collected over decades of family traditions. But photographs lie sometimes. They freeze moments that feel real, but fade like morning mist when you try to hold on to them. The laughter in those pictures has long since died away, replaced by the hollow echo of my footsteps on hardwood floors that once vibrated with the chaos of family life. Now, the silence is so complete that I can hear my grandmother's antique clock ticking in the hallway, marking off the seconds of a life that feels increasingly forgotten. Years of caring for my family, my grandchildren's laughter once filling these rooms, had now turned to silence so profound that even the city noise outside couldn't penetrate it. I would sit in my favorite armchair, a burgundy velvet piece that Robert and I bought when we were young and hopeful, and listen to the emptiness. Sometimes I would catch myself talking to the photographs on the mantel, asking them why everyone had grown so distant, why the phone calls became shorter and less frequent, why the visits stopped altogether. The last blow came when my daughter, Allison, declined my invitation for dinner. Again. I had already bought the ingredients for her favorite meal, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the same recipe my mother taught me when I was a young bride. I had cleaned the house from top to bottom, bought fresh flowers for the dining room table, even put on the pearls she gave me for my 70th birthday. When I called to confirm, her voice was cold and impatient. "I'm busy with work, Mom," she said, using that clipped tone she reserves for telemarketers and people she considers beneath her notice. But I could hear laughter in the background, the clink of wine glasses, the sound of a social gathering that didn't include me. When she said those words, I saw through the lie as clearly as looking through a clean window. The betrayal stung worse than the cold wind that whips off Lake Michigan in January, cutting through your coat and chilling your bones. I stood in my kitchen, still holding the phone after she hung up, surrounded by all the ingredients for a meal no one would eat. The pot roast sat on the counter, slowly warming to room temperature, and I realized it was a perfect metaphor for my life, prepared with love, but ultimately unwanted and destined to spoil. You see, I gave everything, every penny, every hour, every ounce of love I had in my body and soul. I worked as a registered nurse for over 40 years at Chicago's Mercy Hospital, pulling double shifts during the holidays so other nurses could be with their families, standing on my feet for 12 hours straight, dealing with life and death situations that would break most people. I saved lives while my own family slowly slipped away from me like sand through fingers you can't quite close tight enough. My hands bore the scars of that dedication, needle sticks from hurried injections, burns from sterilizing equipment, the permanent ache in my joints from lifting patients who couldn't move themselves. But I never complained. I came home every evening, no matter how exhausted, and cooked dinner for whoever might show up. I kept the refrigerator stocked with everyone's favorite foods, bought birthday presents months in advance, remembered every anniversary and special occasion with cards and calls and carefully chosen gifts. When Allison decided to attend Northwestern Law School, I didn't hesitate to mortgage my house, this very house we fought over in court. The equity I had built up over 20 years of payments became her tuition money, $38,000 for her first year alone. I signed those papers at the kitchen table, the same table where we used to do homework together when she was small, where I helped her with math problems and spelling lists and science projects. "Mom, this means everything to me," she said that day, her eyes bright with tears that I thought were gratitude. "I promise I'll pay you back as soon as I'm established." I believed her because mothers want to believe their children, because love makes us blind to the small deceptions that grow into larger betrayals over time. But the payback never came. Instead, there were more requests, more emergencies that required immediate financial intervention. Her husband Marcus had gambling debts that threatened their marriage. $22,000 to pay off credit cards and bookmakers whose threats were becoming more serious. I liquidated my retirement savings, money I had been accumulating for 30 years, money that was supposed to ensure I could live with dignity in my old age. "It's just temporary, Helen," Marcus assured me, shaking my hand like we were business partners instead of family. "I've got a big investment opportunity coming up, Bitcoin and cryptocurrency trading. There's so much money involved that part of it is even held in digital wallets that could multiply our investment by 10 times. His eyes held that fevered look that gamblers get when they're describing their next sure thing. Their wealth in dollars seemed endless in his imagination, but I should have recognized the desperation underneath the bravado. I bailed them out again when Marcus lost his job, and again when they faced foreclosure on their own home. Each time, I told myself this would be the last time, that once they got back on their feet, things would return to normal. But normal was a country I could no longer find on any map. The costs kept mounting, 15,000 here, 8,000 there, until I realized I had become their personal bank, dispensing not just money, but hope that somehow my generosity would buy their love and respect. I forgave the harsh words, the cold shoulders I received when I asked gentle questions about repayment schedules. I overlooked the whispered criticisms I caught fragments of when they thought I was out of earshot. "She's getting senile," Allison said to Marcus one Thanksgiving while I was washing dishes in the kitchen. "We need to start thinking about what happens when she can't take care of herself anymore." The way she said it, with such clinical detachment, made my stomach clench into a tight knot of hurt and realization. She wasn't talking about my welfare. She was talking about my assets, my home, my financial portfolio that had taken a lifetime to build through careful saving and conservative investments. She was already planning the division of spoils from a woman who was still very much alive and mentally competent. "Mom, you don't understand the sacrifices we make," Allison told me during one of our increasingly tense conversations, her voice sharp and distant as she stood in my living room, checking her phone instead of looking at me directly. "Running a law practice in Chicago isn't easy. The overhead costs, the client development, the networking events. You have no idea how expensive it is to maintain the kind of professional image that brings in the big cases." I wanted to remind her that I knew something about sacrifice, about working long hours for other people's benefit, about putting your own needs last for the sake of others. But I swallowed the hurt like a bitter pill, the way I had learned to do over the years. I nodded and smiled and offered to make her coffee, to bring her some of the cookies I had baked that morning in case she stopped by. But late at night, lying in the bed I had shared with Robert for 23 years before our divorce, I wondered in the quiet darkness of my bedroom, am I just a bank to them? Is that all I've become? The doubt crept in slowly, like the humidity before a Chicago thunderstorm, heavy and oppressive and impossible to ignore. I would replay conversations in my mind, looking for signs of genuine affection among the requests for money and the casual dismissals of my concerns. I tried to remember the last time one of my children had called just to see how I was doing. without needing something from me. I couldn't identify that conversation. It had been months, maybe years, since anyone in my family had shown up simply because they wanted my company. The isolation was like a slow poison working its way through my system. I had friends, certainly, other nurses from the hospital, neighbors who waved from their porches, ladies from the church auxiliary who appreciated my volunteer work with the food pantry. But there's a particular loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who are supposed to love you but treat you like a service provider instead of a person with feelings and needs and dreams that extend beyond their convenience. My birthday passed unnoticed last March. 73 years on this earth, and not a single member of my immediate family remembered. No calls, no cards, no acknowledgement that the woman who had given them life had reached another milestone in her own journey. I sat at my kitchen table that morning, drinking coffee from the mug Tommy had made for me in his middle school pottery class, "World's Best Grandma," painted in uneven blue letters, and waited for the phone to ring. I had dropped subtle hints in the weeks leading up to the date. I mentioned it during my brief phone calls with Allison, wondering aloud if we might have a small celebration, maybe dinner at that Italian restaurant she liked downtown. But the day came and went like any other, marked only by a generic birthday card from my insurance company and a cheerful call from my dentist's office, reminding me about my upcoming cleaning. That evening, I sat in my living room looking at the birthday cake I had bought for myself. A small chocolate cake from the grocery store bakery, the kind a grandmother might buy for a grandchild's birthday if she needed something simple and sweet. I lit a single candle and made a wish, though I wasn't sure what to hope for anymore. The wish felt hollow, like praying to a god who has stopped listening to your particular frequency. When I fell ill last winter, crippling arthritis that made it difficult to climb the stairs to my bedroom, and fluid accumulation in my lungs that left me breathless after the smallest exertion, my daughter sent no one to check on me. I was hospitalized for 4 days with pneumonia, connected to oxygen tubes and IV drips, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of the medical environment where I had spent my career caring for others. The nurses were kind and professional, treating me with the respect and attention I had once given to my own patients. But when visiting hours came, my room remained empty while other patients received flowers and balloon bouquets, and the warm presence of people who cared about their recovery. I watched families gather around other bedsides, holding hands and sharing stories and providing the emotional support that helps healing happen faster than medicine alone. I called Allison from my hospital bed, my voice weak and raspy from the respiratory infection. "I'm at Mercy Hospital," I told her answering machine, because she didn't pick up when she saw my number on her caller ID. "I have pneumonia and I'm quite sick. I thought you might want to know." The message felt pathetic even as I was leaving it, like begging for crumbs of concern from someone who had already decided you weren't worth the effort. She never returned the call. 3 days later, after I had been discharged and was struggling to navigate my own recovery at home, she sent a text message. "Heard you were sick. Hope you're feeling better. Things are crazy busy here." 12 words to acknowledge a medical crisis that could have been fatal. 12 words that felt more like checking an item off a to-do list than expressing genuine concern for my welfare. Friends from the hospital checked in regularly. Margaret from the 3rd floor brought me homemade soup and sat with me while I ate it, making sure I was getting enough nutrition during my recovery. Dr. Patterson, who had been my supervisor in the cardiac unit, stopped by with medical journals and updates from the hospital, treating me like a valued colleague whose contributions had mattered. These people, who owed me nothing beyond professional courtesy, showed more care and consideration than my own flesh and blood. But my own blood seemed absent from the transfusion of love and support that was helping me heal. The abandonment felt like a physical ache, worse than the lingering chest pain from the pneumonia. I began to understand that I was facing more than a temporary illness. I was confronting the reality that the relationships I had prioritized above all else were fundamentally one-sided transactions where I gave, and they took, without any expectation of reciprocity or even acknowledgement. It wasn't until I found a letter accidentally delivered to my neighbor's door that I learned the truth about just how absent they planned to be from my future. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door brought it over on a Tuesday afternoon, apologizing for the postal service mix-up. The envelope was thick and official-looking, with the return address of a law firm I didn't recognize. "I think this belongs to you, Helen," she said, her kind face creased with concern. "It looks important." She lingered on my doorstep, probably sensing that whatever was inside that envelope would be significant, but too polite to ask direct questions about my private business. I thanked her and closed the door, staring at the envelope in my hands. The paper felt expensive, the kind that law firms use when they want to convey authority and seriousness. My name was typed across the front in formal letters: Mrs. Helen Margaret O'Connor. Not Mom or Grandma or any of the familial titles I had earned through decades of service and sacrifice. Just my legal name, as if I were a stranger being served with court documents, which, it turned out, was exactly what was happening. Inside was a legal notice informing me that my daughter Allison, acting as executor of a family trust I had never heard of, had petitioned the Cook County Probate Court to assume control of my assets for the protection and welfare of the beneficiary. The paperwork was filled with legal language designed to obscure its true meaning, but the intent was clear enough. They wanted to take control of my house, my savings, my investment portfolio, everything I had worked my entire life to accumulate. The petition claimed that I was showing signs of diminished capacity and financial irresponsibility that pose a risk to the family estate. It cited my previous loans to family members as evidence of poor judgment, twisting my generosity into proof of incompetence. It suggested that I needed professional management of my assets to prevent further dissipation of inherited wealth. Inherited wealth, as if everything I owned was somehow theirs by right, as if my decades of work and saving and planning were just holding on to their property until they decided to claim it. The presumption was breathtaking in its selfishness, but also clever in its legal construction. Allison had learned her craft well in law school, the school I had paid for with the equity in this very house they were now trying to steal. I sat on the worn carpet of my living room, the envelope and its contents scattered around me like debris from an explosion. The silence was deafening. I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway, the distant sound of traffic on Irving Park Road, the settling creaks of a house that had sheltered my family for decades and was now being torn away from me through legal manipulation and betrayal. The weight of the realization settled over me like a heavy blanket. This wasn't an impulsive decision or a moment of poor judgment. This was a calculated plan that had been in development for months, maybe years. The paperwork was too comprehensive, too detailed, too professionally prepared to be anything other than a long-term strategy. While I had been worrying about their financial problems and mortgaging my security to help them, they had been plotting to take everything I had left. I gripped the chipped porcelain teacup I had been holding when I opened the letter. My grandmother's heirloom, painted with tiny roses and edged in gold that had worn thin with age and use. The cup had been in our family for 3 generations, a small but precious link to women who had faced their own hardships with dignity and strength. As the reality of my daughter's betrayal sank in, my hands began to shake with a rage I had never allowed myself to feel before. The delicate china couldn't withstand the pressure of my clenched fists. I felt it shatter in my grip, fragments cutting into my palm, drawing small drops of blood that spotted the legal documents at my feet. The physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional devastation I was experiencing, but somehow the broken cup became a symbol of everything that was breaking inside me. Tears rolled silently down my cheeks, a quiet surrender to years of invisible pain that I had been carrying alone. I had cried before, when Robert left me for his secretary, when I lost patients at the hospital, when my own mother died after a long battle with cancer, but this was different. This was the weeping of someone who realizes that the ground they thought was solid beneath their feet had been shifting all along, preparing to give way at the moment of greatest vulnerability. But in the depths of that despair, as I sat surrounded by broken porcelain and legal threats, a small voice whispered something I hadn't heard in years. Enough. The word seemed to come from somewhere deep inside me, from a place that remembered what it felt like to stand up for myself, to fight for what was right, instead of always yielding to what was easy. For the first time in decades, I imagined saying no to my family's demands. I pictured myself refusing to sign documents that would transfer my life's work into their control, I envisioned myself fighting back against the assumption that I was too weak, too old, too confused to manage my own affairs. The image was both terrifying and exhilarating, the prospect of reclaiming my power after years of giving it away in small pieces. I stood up slowly, my arthritic knees protesting the movement, and walked to the hallway mirror where I had checked my appearance every morning for 25 years. The woman looking back at me was someone I barely recognized. Tired, betrayed, wounded, but not defeated. Her eyes held a spark of defiance that had been buried under years of submission and self-sacrifice. I stared long into that cracked mirror, tracing the lines of an old woman I was just beginning to know. My face showed the wear of decades spent caring for others, but also the strength of someone who had survived challenges that would have broken weaker people. I had raised children, ended a difficult marriage, built a career in one of the most demanding professions, weathered financial hardships and personal losses. I was not the helpless, incompetent woman my daughter's legal documents described. "You are not finished," I told my reflection, speaking aloud for the first time in days. "You are not weak, and you are not going to let them steal your life." The words felt strange in my mouth, like a foreign language I was learning to speak. But they also felt true in a way that nothing had felt true for a very long time. That night, I called Allison. My hands were steady as I dialed her number, and my voice was calm when she answered with her usual impatient tone. "I received some interesting paperwork today," I told her, without preamble or apology for calling during what she would consider an inconvenient time. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. She knew exactly what paperwork I was referring to, which confirmed that the accidental delivery had revealed something she had planned to keep hidden until it was too late for me to respond effectively. "Mom, I can explain," she began, her voice taking on that smooth, persuasive quality she had learned in law school and perfected in her practice. "This isn't what you think. It's a protection measure, something we set up to help you manage your finances more effectively. You've been making some questionable decisions lately, and we're concerned about your ability to—" "Stop," I interrupted, cutting off her prepared speech. The firmness in my own voice surprised me. "I know exactly what this is, Allison. This is theft disguised as concern. This is greed wrapped in legal language, and I will not tolerate it." The silence that followed was different from her earlier pause. This was the quiet of someone who had been caught in a deception and was scrambling to adjust their strategy. "You're overreacting, Mom. You don't understand the complexities of estate planning and asset protection. We're trying to help you preserve your wealth for the family, to make sure everything is handled properly when you can no longer make these decisions for yourself." But I was no longer listening to her words. I was hearing the condescension underneath them, the assumption that I was too simple to understand my own financial situation, the arrogance of someone who believed she could manipulate me with sophisticated-sounding justifications for what was essentially a con game. "I understand perfectly," I replied. "I understand that you see me as an obstacle to your inheritance rather than your mother. I understand that every dollar I've given you, every sacrifice I've made, has been insufficient to buy your respect or affection, and I understand that I need to protect myself from you." Before she could respond with more legal jargon or emotional manipulation, I hung up the phone. The silence that followed felt different from the loneliness I had been experiencing. This was the silence of decision, of a line being drawn, of a woman who was finally ready to fight for her own dignity. The next morning, I called Hamilton and Associates, a law firm I found through an internet search for elder law attorneys in Chicago. The receptionist was kind and professional, scheduling me for a consultation that same afternoon with Mr. Daniel Ramirez, a lawyer who specialized in financial abuse cases involving family members. Mr. Ramirez's office was located downtown, in one of those tall buildings that catch the morning light off Lake Michigan and throw it back across the city like a beacon. I hadn't been downtown in months, and the energy of the city, people hurrying along the sidewalks with purpose and determination, reminded me of what it felt like to have goals and plans that extended beyond mere survival. Daniel Ramirez was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a gentle manner that put me at ease immediately. He listened without interruption as I explained my situation. occasionally taking notes, but mostly just giving me the gift of his complete attention. When I finished my story, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me with something I hadn't seen in months. Respect. "Mrs. O'Connor," he said, "what your daughter is attempting is called financial elder abuse, and it's both illegal and unfortunately common. The good news is that you discovered it before any legal action was completed. The better news is that Illinois law provides strong protections for people in your situation, including the possibility of both civil and criminal remedies." He explained that we could file a motion to dismiss her petition while simultaneously pursuing a counterclaim for emotional and financial damages. "The courts take these cases very seriously," he told me, "especially when there's evidence of a pattern of financial exploitation over time. And from what you've described, your daughter's requests for money, combined with this legal action, constitute exactly that kind of pattern." For the first time in months, I felt hope stirring in my chest like the first warm breeze of spring after a brutal Chicago winter. Mr. Ramirez wasn't just offering legal representation. He was treating me like a person whose rights mattered, whose story deserved to be heard, whose welfare was worthy of professional attention and care. We spent 2 hours going through my financial records, documenting the loans I had made to family members, the mortgages and withdrawals that had depleted my savings, the systematic exploitation that had masqueraded as family support. The numbers were staggering even to me. Over the past 5 years, I had transferred more than $200,000 to various family members, including funds that had been earmarked for my own care in case of medical emergency or long-term care needs. "This represents a vast fortune that you worked your entire life to accumulate," Mr. Ramirez observed, reviewing the investment statements and savings account records I had brought with me. "Your assets in stocks and stock market investments alone could have generated enough dividend income to support your retirement comfortably. The fact that you depleted these resources to support adult children who were capable of supporting themselves constitutes a form of undue influence and financial manipulation." He pointed out that my nursing career, my years of overtime and double shifts, my careful budgeting and conservative investing had created a substantial portfolio that should have lasted through any reasonable retirement scenario. "You were financially successful by any measure," he continued. "Your daughter's petition claims you're incompetent to manage these assets, but the reality is quite the opposite. You managed them so well that they became attractive targets for people who didn't want to wait for a natural inheritance." Mr. Ramirez proposed filing a counterclaim seeking damages of $6 million, a figure that represented not just the money I had already given them, but punitive damages for the emotional abuse, the exploitation of trust, and the attempted theft of my remaining assets. "The purpose isn't necessarily to collect that entire amount," he explained. "The purpose is to send a clear message that elder abuse has consequences, and to position you as the plaintiff rather than the victim in this legal proceeding." I agreed to everything he proposed. For the first time in years, I was taking action instead of simply reacting to other people's demands and manipulations. I was asserting my rights instead of apologizing for having needs. I was fighting back instead of surrendering to the assumption that my role in the family was to be used until I had nothing left to give. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The city sounds outside my window, the distant L train, the late-night traffic, the hum of urban life continuing around me, felt comforting instead of lonely. I was no longer isolated in my struggle. I had an advocate, a plan, and most importantly, a renewed sense of my own worth and dignity. But my newfound peace was short-lived. The next morning brought a series of phone calls from various family members who had apparently been briefed on my betrayal of their financial expectations. My ex-husband Robert called first, his voice carrying that familiar tone of annoyed authority he had used throughout our marriage whenever I failed to comply with his preferences. "Helen, what the hell do you think you're doing?" he began, without even a greeting or inquiry about my health. "Allison called me crying last night, saying you've hired some lawyer to make threats against her. This is family business, not some courtroom drama. You need to call off your attack dog and handle this the way mature adults handle family disagreements." The irony of him lecturing me about mature adult behavior while calling my lawyer an attack dog wasn't lost on me. This was the same man who had carried on a 2-year affair with his secretary before finally asking for a divorce. The same man who had fought me over every asset during our settlement. The same man who now lived in a downtown condo with his much younger wife and rarely remembered to call on holidays or birthdays. "Robert," I replied calmly. This stopped being a family disagreement when Allison filed legal papers to steal my house. If she wants to use the courts to resolve our differences, then the courts are where we'll resolve them. "You're being selfish and vindictive," he continued, his voice rising with the kind of anger men display when women refuse to be reasonable, which usually means refusing to give them what they want. "This isn't about money. It's about family unity. We're trying to help you, to make sure you're taken care of properly in your old age. But you're too stubborn and proud to accept help when it's offered." I could hear the echo of conversations he'd had with Allison, the way they had framed my resistance as evidence of mental decline rather than healthy self-preservation. They had convinced themselves that taking control of my assets was an act of love and protection, rather than theft and manipulation. The delusion was almost impressive in its completeness. "Help?" I asked. "Is that what you call taking someone's home away from them? Is that how you define care and protection?" I could feel my voice getting stronger, fueled by months of suppressed anger and hurt. "I don't need your help, Robert. I need your respect. And if you can't give me that basic courtesy, then I don't need anything else from you." The conversation with my son Tommy was even more painful because it carried the sting of unexpected betrayal. Tommy had always been the peacemaker in our family, the one who tried to smooth over conflicts and find compromises that would make everyone happy. I had counted on his support, or at least his neutrality, in this battle with his sister. But when he called that afternoon, his voice was tight with disappointment and frustration. "Mom, I can't believe you're doing this to Allie. She's been trying to help you for years, and now you're threatening to sue her? Do you have any idea how much stress you're putting on her? On all of us?" The fact that he called her Allie instead of Allison told me everything I needed to know about whose side he was choosing in this conflict. It was the nickname he'd used for her when they were children, playing together in the backyard of this same house where I now sat defending my right to remain in my own home. "Tommy," I said, trying to keep my voice gentle because he was my baby, the child who had struggled the most with our divorce and who had needed extra reassurance and support throughout his adolescence. "I'm not doing anything to your sister. I'm protecting myself from what she's trying to do to me. There's a difference." "That's not how she tells it," he replied. "She says you're confused about the legal paperwork, that it's just a way to make sure your assets are protected if something happens to your health. She says you're overreacting because you don't understand estate planning and financial management." I realized that Allison had been having conversations with Tommy and probably other family members, shaping the narrative to make me appear irrational and confused, while positioning herself as the responsible adult trying to manage a difficult situation. It was a sophisticated gaslighting campaign designed to isolate me from potential allies within the family. "Tommy, did your sister tell you that she filed legal papers to take control of my house without telling me? Did she mention that she's trying to have me declared incompetent to manage my own affairs? Did she explain that I only found out about this by accident, because the paperwork was delivered to the wrong address?" There was a pause, the kind that indicates someone is processing information that doesn't match the story they've been told. She said it was a protective measure, something proactive to help you avoid problems down the road. "And did you ask her why she needed to protect me secretly, without my knowledge or consent? Did you wonder why she didn't discuss these concerns with me directly if she was genuinely worried about my welfare?" The silence that followed was longer this time. Tommy was a thoughtful person when he wasn't being influenced by stronger personalities, and I could almost hear him working through the logical inconsistencies in his sister's version of events. "I don't know, Mom," he said finally. "I just know that this whole situation is tearing the family apart. Can't you guys work this out without lawyers and court battles and all this legal stuff? Can't we just sit down and talk about it like adults?" The sweetness of his desire for family harmony broke my heart, because it reminded me of the little boy who used to get upset when his father and I argued, who would stand between us with his arms spread wide and beg us to stop fighting. But I was no longer willing to sacrifice my own welfare for the illusion of family unity. "I tried to talk, sweetheart," I told him. I tried for years to talk, but talking only works when both sides are willing to listen and compromise. Your sister isn't interested in compromise. She wants control of my assets, and she's using legal action to get it. I'm simply defending myself with the same tools she chose to use against me. But it was my conversation with 12-year-old Maya, Tommy's daughter and my youngest grandchild, that reminded me why this fight was worth having. She called me later that week, her voice small and worried in the way that children sound when the adults in their world are behaving in ways they can't understand. "Grandma, are you really sick?" she asked without preamble, getting straight to the heart of what was worrying her. "Dad said that Aunt Allison is trying to help you because you're having trouble thinking clearly, but you sound like yourself to me. You don't sound confused or anything." The innocence of her question, the way she cut through all the adult manipulation and legal complexity to ask about the only thing that really mattered to her, whether her grandmother was okay, nearly brought me to tears. This was the child who had spent weekend afternoons with me, learning to bake cookies and listening to stories about what Chicago was like when I was young. This was the grandchild who called me just to tell me about school plays and science projects and friend drama that seemed monumentally important to a 12-year-old girl. "I'm not sick, sweetheart," I assured her. "I'm not confused or unable to take care of myself. I'm just having a disagreement with some adults in our family about some grown-up business. But I want you to know that none of this changes how much I love you or how proud I am of the smart, caring young woman you're becoming." "I love you too, Grandma," she replied, and I could hear tears in her voice. "I don't understand why everyone is so angry all the time lately. I wish things could just go back to normal, like they used to be." Her words stayed with me long after we hung up, because they reminded me that there were innocent casualties in this family war, people who didn't deserve to be hurt by the greed and selfishness that was driving the conflict. Maya didn't care about trust funds or asset protection or inheritance planning. She just wanted her family to love each other and treat each other with kindness and respect. But I also realized that going back to normal wasn't an option, because normal had been a situation where I was systematically exploited and disrespected while pretending that everything was fine. Normal had been unsustainable for me, which was why we had reached this crisis point. If I wanted Maya to grow up in a family that modeled healthy relationships and appropriate boundaries, then I needed to stand up for myself and demonstrate that love doesn't require accepting abuse or manipulation. The legal process moved forward with surprising speed. Mr. Ramirez filed our response to Allison's petition along with our counterclaim, and within 2 weeks, we received notice that a hearing had been scheduled in Cook County Probate Court. Judge Patricia Morrison, a woman with a reputation for taking elder abuse cases seriously, would hear arguments from both sides and make a determination about the validity of the trust petition and the merit of our financial abuse claims. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, I experienced a transformation that surprised everyone, including myself. For the first time in years, I had a purpose that extended beyond managing other people's crises and meeting other people's expectations. I was fighting for something that mattered: my dignity, my autonomy, my right to control my own life and resources. I started taking better care of myself, eating regular meals and getting proper sleep instead of staying awake worrying about family problems I couldn't solve. I began taking walks around my neighborhood, reacquainting myself with the corner stores and small restaurants and community spaces that had been part of my daily life before I became consumed with other people's needs and demands. My neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, noticed the change immediately. "You look different, Helen," she observed one morning when we encountered each other at the local farmer's market. "You seem lighter somehow, like you're not carrying such a heavy burden." She was right. The burden I had been carrying, the responsibility for everyone else's happiness and financial security, the guilt over not doing enough to keep the family together, the shame over being discarded despite decades of sacrifice, was finally lifting from my shoulders. I was remembering what it felt like to be Helen O'Connor, not just mom or grandma, or the person who solved everyone else's problems. I also started attending a support group for seniors dealing with family financial abuse. The group met weekly at a community center just a few blocks from my house, and I was amazed to discover how common my experience was. There were other parents who had mortgaged their retirement security to help adult children, other grandparents who had been systematically drained of resources by family members who saw them as ATMs rather than human beings deserving of respect and consideration. The stories I heard were heartbreaking, but also empowering, because they reminded me that I wasn't alone in this struggle and that recovery was possible. There was Margaret, whose son had stolen her credit card information and run up $60,000 in charges before she discovered the fraud. There was Frank, whose daughter had convinced him to add her name to his bank accounts and then systematically transferred his life savings to her own accounts. There was Dorothy, whose grandson had forged her signature on loan documents and used her house as collateral for his business ventures that failed within 6 months. But there were also success stories, people who had fought back and won, who had reclaimed their assets and their dignity through legal action and personal transformation. They shared strategies for dealing with manipulative family members, resources for financial recovery, and most importantly, validation for the anger and hurt that comes from being betrayed by people you love and trust. The hardest part? Explained Dr. Sarah Chen, the social worker who facilitated our group, is letting go of the fantasy that if you just love them enough, sacrifice enough, give enough, they will finally appreciate you and treat you with respect. The reality is that people who exploit family members are not motivated by normal family dynamics. They're motivated by greed and entitlement, and no amount of generosity on your part will change that fundamental character flaw. Her words hit me like a physical blow because they forced me to confront the truth I had been avoiding for years. I had been trying to buy love from people who were incapable of giving it, investing emotional and financial resources in relationships that were fundamentally transactional rather than reciprocal. My generosity hadn't been appreciated. It had been seen as evidence of weakness and naivety that could be exploited for personal gain. But Dr. Chen also offered hope. Recovery isn't just about reclaiming your money or your property, she explained. It's about reclaiming your sense of self-worth and your right to be treated with dignity and respect. It's about learning the difference between love and manipulation, between family loyalty and financial exploitation. The night before the court hearing, I sat in my living room surrounded by boxes of documents, financial records, photographs, and letters that would tell the story of my relationship with my daughter. Mr. Ramirez had helped me organize everything into a narrative that demonstrated the pattern of financial abuse and emotional manipulation that had escalated into the legal theft we were now fighting in court. There were bank statements showing the systematic depletion of my savings account through transfers to family members. There were mortgage documents showing how I had risked my home to pay for law school tuition and gambling debts. There were copies of loan agreements that had never been honored, promises of repayment that had never materialized. There were receipts for gifts and financial assistance that totaled more than $250,000 over 5 years. But there were also more personal items that told the story of my emotional investment in relationships that had never provided equivalent returns. There were birthday cards I had sent that were never acknowledged, photographs from family gatherings I had organized and paid for, letters I had written during difficult periods in their lives offering support and encouragement. Looking at all this evidence spread across my coffee table, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because it represented the death of dreams I had held about what family relationships could be. Relief because it validated my decision to fight back instead of continuing to accept abuse in the name of family harmony. I also felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Pride in myself. Pride in the woman who had worked double shifts to put her daughter through law school. Pride in the nurse who had saved lives and comforted families during their worst moments. Pride in the grandmother who had tried to provide stability and security for her grandchildren. Pride in the fighter who had finally decided to stand up for herself when everyone else had written her off as a convenient victim. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, with wood-paneled walls and high windows that let in the gray October light that characterizes Chicago in the fall. Judge Morrison was a woman in her 60s with iron gray hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see through pretense and manipulation to the truth underneath. She had a reputation for being tough but fair, particularly in cases involving elder abuse and family financial exploitation. Allison arrived with her own attorney, a well-dressed man in his 40s who specialized in estate planning and trust administration. She looked professional and composed in a navy blue suit that I recognized as expensive, probably purchased with money she had borrowed from me months earlier for business expenses. Her confidence was evident in the way she walked, the way she arranged her paperwork, the way she glanced at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance, as if I were a child throwing a tantrum over something I didn't understand. But when she looked at me across the courtroom, I saw something else in her expression that I hadn't seen before: uncertainty. For the first time in our relationship, she wasn't in complete control of the situation. She couldn't manipulate the judge the way she had learned to manipulate me. She couldn't use emotional blackmail or financial pressure to get her way. She was facing someone, me, who was finally fighting back with the same legal weapons she had chosen to use against me. Mr. Ramirez presented our case methodically and thoroughly, walking Judge Morrison through the pattern of financial exploitation that had culminated in the trust petition. He showed how my loans to family members had systematically depleted assets I had accumulated through decades of work and careful financial planning. He demonstrated that my investment portfolio, if left untouched, would have provided substantial income for my retirement and potential long-term care needs. Your Honor, he argued, Mrs. O'Connor's financial decisions were not the result of diminished capacity or poor judgment. They were the result of exploitation by family members who saw her generosity as weakness and her love as an opportunity for personal gain. The trust petition represents not protection for a vulnerable adult, but attempted theft by a daughter who was not content to wait for a natural inheritance. He presented evidence that my daughter's law practice was struggling financially, that she owed significant money to creditors, that gaining control of my assets would solve her immediate cash flow problems while providing long-term financial security she had been unable to achieve through her own professional efforts. The counterclaim we're presenting today seeks damages not just for the money that was taken from Mrs. O'Connor, but for the emotional abuse she endured while being systematically exploited by people she trusted, Mr. Ramirez continued. The amount of $4.6 million represents both actual damages and punitive damages designed to send a clear message that elder abuse has consequences, regardless of whether the abuser happens to be a family member. When it was Allison's attorney's turn to present their case, he focused on my age, my medical history, and what he characterized as increasingly erratic financial decisions over the past several years. He pointed to the money I had given to family members as evidence of poor judgment, twisting my generosity into proof of incompetence. Mrs. O'Connor has shown a pattern of making large financial gifts and loans without proper consideration of her own long-term needs, he argued. The family trust is designed to protect her remaining assets and ensure that she receives proper care as she ages. This is not theft. This is responsible estate planning designed to prevent further dissipation of family wealth. But when Judge Morrison began asking questions, it became clear that she was not impressed by arguments that characterized generosity as incompetence or that justified taking someone's property without their consent in the name of protection. Counselor, she said to Allison's attorney, can you explain why this trust was created without Mrs. O'Connor's knowledge or participation? If the goal was truly her protection and welfare, wouldn't the appropriate approach have been to discuss these concerns with her directly and involve her in any planning decisions? The attorney's response was evasive and unconvincing, full of legal jargon that couldn't disguise the fundamental flaw in their approach. They had acted in secret because they knew she would never have consented to their plan. They had tried to bypass her autonomy because they assumed she was too weak or confused to resist their manipulation. Judge Morrison asked to review the financial records that documented my loans to family members, and she spent several minutes examining the pattern of requests and responses, the escalating amounts, the promises of repayment that were never honored. It appears to me, she observed, that Mrs. O'Connor's financial difficulties, to the extent they exist, were caused not by poor judgment on her part, but by systematic exploitation by family members who saw her as a source of funding for their own financial problems. The solution to exploitation is not to take away the victim's autonomy, it's to stop the exploitation. She then asked me to speak directly about my situation, and for the first time in years, I felt like someone in authority was genuinely interested in hearing my perspective rather than dismissing my concerns as the confused complaints of an elderly woman. I stood up slowly, my arthritis making the movement somewhat difficult, but my voice was clear and strong when I began to speak. Your Honor, I am 73 years old, and I have been a registered nurse for over 40 years. I have dealt with life and death situations, managed complex medical treatments, and made thousands of critical decisions under pressure. I am not confused, incompetent, or unable to manage my own affairs. I went on to explain how my financial problems had been created not by poor judgment, but by a series of loans and gifts to family members who had exploited my love and generosity. I described the systematic pressure I had faced to mortgage my security for their convenience, the emotional manipulation that had been used to overcome my resistance to their increasingly unreasonable demands. I have given my daughter over $200,000 during the past 5 years, I continued. I paid for her law school education. I bailed out her husband's gambling debts. I helped with their mortgage payments and business expenses. Every time, I was told this was temporary, that they would repay me as soon as they got back on their feet. But repayment never came. Instead, there were new crises, new emergencies that required additional financial assistance. I pulled out the folder of documents that Mr. Ramirez and I had prepared, a comprehensive record of the financial exploitation I had endured. I discovered this trust petition by accident, Your Honor. If the paperwork had been delivered correctly, I might never have known about it until it was too late to defend myself. That's not protection. That's theft, disguised as concern. Judge Morrison listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as I described specific incidents of manipulation and financial pressure. When I finished, she asked Allison to respond to my allegations, and for the first time in the proceedings, my daughter's composure began to crack. Your Honor, my mother is exaggerating the situation, she began, but her voice lacked the confidence she had displayed earlier. I have always acted in her best interests. The money she gave us wasn't stolen. It was given freely, and we're grateful for her generosity. But lately, she's been making increasingly poor decisions, and we're worried about her ability to manage such substantial assets. Can you give me specific examples of these poor decisions? Judge Morrison asked. Allison hesitated, clearly not expecting to be challenged on what she probably assumed would be accepted as self-evident truth. Well, she's been giving money to various charities and organizations without proper research into their legitimacy, and she's been talking about expensive trips and purchases that don't make financial sense for someone in her situation. By expensive trips, the judge pressed, are you referring to Mrs. O'Connor's desire to use her own money for her own enjoyment and fulfillment? And by various charities, are you referring to her donations to established organizations like her church and local food bank? Contributions that are both tax-deductible and consistent with a lifetime of community service? It was clear that Allison hadn't expected her characterizations to be examined so closely, and her responses became increasingly defensive and unconvincing. She couldn't provide specific examples of irresponsible behavior because my actual decisions had been reasonable and appropriate for someone in my financial situation. Her entire case was based on the assumption that any use of my money for my own benefit, rather than preserving it for her eventual inheritance, constituted evidence of incompetence. The hearing lasted nearly 3 hours, and by the end, it was clear that Judge Morrison had seen through the manipulation and recognized the truth of my situation. When she announced her decision, her words were both a vindication of my position and a condemnation of my daughter's behavior. I find no evidence that Mrs. O'Connor lacks the capacity to manage her own affairs, Judge Morrison declared. The financial decisions that have been characterized as evidence of incompetence appear to be the result of systematic exploitation by family members, rather than poor judgment on her part. The petition to establish a trust for her assets is denied. But then she continued with something I hadn't dared to hope for. Furthermore, I find merit in the counterclaim alleging financial elder abuse. The evidence presented shows a clear pattern of exploitation that has caused substantial financial and emotional harm to Mrs. O'Connor. While the full amount of damages will need to be determined through additional proceedings, I am awarding preliminary damages in the amount of $2.1 million to be paid by the defendants within 30 days. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the blood rushing through my veins like a river that had been dammed for years and was finally flowing freely again. Across the room, Allison's face had gone completely white, and her attorney was frantically scribbling notes as if he could somehow write his way out of the disaster that had just befallen his client. But more important than the money was the validation, the official recognition that I had been wronged and that my suffering mattered. For years, I had been told that I was overreacting, that I was misunderstanding the situation, that I was being unreasonable in my expectations of basic respect and consideration. Now, a judge, someone with the authority to determine truth from fiction, had confirmed that I had been abused and exploited, and that such treatment was unacceptable regardless of family relationships. As we left the courthouse, Mr. Ramirez walked beside me with obvious satisfaction at the outcome. "This is one of the most decisive victories I've seen in an elder abuse case," he told me. "Judge Morrison doesn't award damages of this magnitude unless she's convinced that serious wrongdoing has occurred. Your daughter and her attorney underestimated both your strength and the court's commitment to protecting vulnerable adults from financial exploitation. But even as we celebrated the legal victory, I knew that the real battle was just beginning. The court decision would change the financial dynamics of my relationship with my family, but it wouldn't necessarily change their attitudes or their willingness to accept responsibility for their behavior. I was prepared for retaliation, for attempts to undermine the court's decision, for escalated manipulation designed to punish me for fighting back. I didn't have to wait long. That evening, my phone rang constantly with calls from family members who were outraged by the court's decision and my role in pursuing legal action against Allison. The message was consistent. I was being vindictive and unreasonable. I was destroying family relationships over money that should be shared willingly. I was using the legal system to get revenge for imaginary grievances. Robert called first, his voice shaking with anger. "Are you satisfied now, Helen? You've humiliated your own daughter in public, cost her a fortune she doesn't have, and probably destroyed her law practice in the process. I hope you're proud of yourself." "I didn't humiliate her, Robert," I replied calmly. "She humiliated herself by trying to steal my house and then lying about it in court. I simply defended myself with the same legal tools she chose to use against me." "This isn't about defense," he shot back. "This is about greed and revenge. You've turned into a bitter old woman who would rather destroy her family than admit she needs help managing her affairs." The cruelty of his words was breathtaking, but they no longer had the power to wound me the way they once did. I had heard the truth about my situation from an impartial judge, had received validation from legal experts, had gained the support of other survivors who understood my experience. Robert's opinion, which had once carried the weight of authority in my life, now sounded like the desperate complaints of someone who had been caught in wrongdoing and was trying to shift blame to his victim. Tommy's call was more painful because it came wrapped in disappointment and hurt rather than anger. "Mom, I can't believe you actually went through with this lawsuit. I thought you were just trying to get Allie's attention, to force a family meeting where we could work things out privately. I never imagined you would actually try to bankrupt your own daughter." "Tommy, I tried for years to work things out privately," I reminded him. "I had dozens of conversations with your sister about repayment schedules, about boundaries, about my need to reserve some resources for my own security. Those conversations were ignored or dismissed. The lawsuit happened because private negotiations failed, not because I was unwilling to try them. But $1 million, Mom? Don't you think that's excessive? Don't you think there might have been a better way to handle this situation?" I realized that Tommy, like many people, was more comfortable with the idea of women suffering in silence than with the idea of women fighting back effectively. He could accept his mother being taken advantage of, but he struggled with his mother being strong enough to demand justice and compensation for the abuse she had endured. "The amount wasn't my decision, sweetheart," I explained. "The judge determined that based on the evidence presented and the legal standards for damages in financial abuse cases, if you think it's excessive, then perhaps you should consider how excessive the abuse was that justified such an award." But it was the call from Allison herself that revealed the true depth of her narcissism and her inability to accept responsibility for her actions. Instead of apologizing for the pain she had caused or expressing regret for her choices, she launched into a tirade about how she was the real victim in this situation. "I can't believe you've destroyed my life over money, Mom," she began, her voice carrying that familiar tone of righteous indignation she had perfected in law school. "Do you have any idea what this lawsuit is going to do to my practice, to my reputation, to my family's financial security? My clients are already asking questions about my judgment and my ethics. This could destroy everything I've worked for." The irony was stunning. She had tried to destroy my financial security and questioned my competence in court, but she expected me to be concerned about the impact of my defense on her professional reputation. She had attempted to steal my house and assets, but she was outraged that I had fought back successfully and won damages that would help restore my financial position. "Allison," I said quietly, "you destroyed your own reputation when you filed legal papers to steal my house without telling me. You damaged your own practice when you chose to exploit your elderly mother instead of building success through your own professional efforts. The consequences you're facing are the direct result of choices you made, not actions I took." "That's not how I see it," she replied coldly. "And that's not how the rest of the family sees it either. You've made your choice, Mom. You've chosen money over family, legal victories over relationships, revenge over forgiveness. I hope it was worth it." The finality in her voice was both heartbreaking and liberating. Heartbreaking because it represented the death of my dreams about what our relationship could become. Liberating because it freed me from the obligation to keep trying to earn love and respect from someone who was incapable of giving either in any genuine form. But even as I mourned the loss of the relationship I had hoped to have with my daughter, I felt a deep sense of peace about the relationship I had finally chosen to have with myself. For the first time in decades, I was prioritizing my own welfare over other people's convenience. I was demanding respect instead of accepting abuse. I was using my resources for my own benefit instead of depleting them to solve other people's problems. The days following the court decision brought both expected challenges and surprising sources of support. Several family members did indeed side with Allison, echoing her narrative that I was being vindictive and unreasonable in pursuing legal remedies for what they characterized as normal family disagreements. Some old friendships became strained as people who had never experienced financial abuse struggled to understand why I couldn't simply forgive and forget. But I also discovered allies in unexpected places. My neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had inadvertently saved me from financial ruin by delivering the misplaced legal papers, became a close friend and confidant. She had immigrated from Mexico as a young woman and built a successful small business through hard work and determination. She understood what it meant to be underestimated and exploited, and she admired my willingness to fight for my rights despite the personal cost. "You did the right thing, Helen," she told me one evening as we sat on my front porch, watching the neighborhood come alive with families returning home from work and school. "In my culture, we're taught to respect our elders, to honor the sacrifices they made for us. What your daughter did, trying to steal from the woman who gave her everything, that's not family loyalty. That's greed disguised as concern." Dr. Chen from the support group also provided invaluable guidance as I navigated the emotional aftermath of my legal victory. "Recovery from financial abuse is similar to recovery from any other type of trauma," she explained. "There will be days when you doubt yourself, when you wonder if you did the right thing, when you feel guilty for standing up for yourself. Those feelings are normal, but they don't mean you made the wrong choice." She helped me understand that my family's anger about the lawsuit was actually evidence that my actions had been necessary and effective. "People who exploit others are always outraged when their victims fight back," she observed. "They're comfortable with a dynamic where they take and you give, where they make demands and you comply, where they benefit from your generosity without offering anything in return. When you change that dynamic, they experience it as an attack on their entitlement rather than a defense of your rights." The financial aspects of my victory also opened up possibilities I hadn't considered in years. With the court-ordered damages being paid by Allison, my depleted savings and investment accounts could be restored to their previous levels. I could afford to travel, to pursue hobbies and interests I had abandoned during the years when every available dollar went to solving other people's crises. But more importantly, the money represented something beyond financial security. It was a symbol of justice, of recognition that my life and welfare mattered, of validation that I deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. Every dollar of those damages represented a day of my life spent working to build security that someone else had tried to steal. Getting that money back wasn't about greed. It was about restoration of what was rightfully mine. However, my sense of peace and resolution was shattered 3 weeks after the court decision, when I discovered that my legal victory had triggered an even more vicious campaign of retaliation than I had anticipated. The discovery came through Maya, my 12-year-old granddaughter, during one of our regular phone calls. "Grandma," she said in a small, confused voice, "some kids at school are saying mean things about you. They're saying their parents heard that you're crazy and that you stole money from Aunt Allison. I told them it wasn't true, but they keep saying it anyway." My heart sank as I realized that Allison had decided to wage a public relations campaign designed to destroy my reputation in the community where I had lived and worked for decades. By spreading false stories about my mental state and the nature of our legal dispute, she was attempting to isolate me socially and undermine the credibility I had gained through my court victory. The full extent of her campaign became clear over the next few days, as friends and acquaintances began treating me differently. Mrs. Patterson from the grocery store, who had always greeted me warmly and asked about my family, now avoided eye contact and gave me curt responses when I tried to make conversation. Dr. Williams, my longtime physician, seemed defensive and uncomfortable during my routine appointment, as if he had been told that I might be suffering from paranoid delusions about family members trying to steal my money. Most painfully, the director of the food bank where I had volunteered for 15 years called to tell me that my services were no longer needed. "We've received some concerning reports about your situation, Helen," she said with obvious discomfort. "Until things settle down and we have a clearer picture of what's happening in your personal life, we think it would be best if you took a break from your volunteer activities." The message was clear. Allison had convinced people that I was mentally unstable, potentially dangerous, someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted in situations involving vulnerable populations or financial responsibilities. The irony was bitter. I was being punished for protecting myself from financial abuse by being characterized as someone who would abuse others. But this final betrayal, this attempt to destroy not just my financial security, but my social connections and community standing, served as the ultimate test of my transformation. The old Helen would have crumbled under this kind of public humiliation, would have considered withdrawing the lawsuit and accepting whatever terms Allison offered in exchange for ending the character assassination campaign. The new Helen, the woman who had learned to fight for her own dignity, had a different response. Instead of hiding or defending myself through private conversations that could be dismissed as the desperate explanations of someone who was genuinely confused, I decided to take my story public in a way that would make the truth impossible to ignore. I contacted the Chicago Tribune's senior affairs reporter, a journalist who specialized in stories about elder abuse and family financial exploitation. I offered to share my complete story, including all the court documents and financial records that proved the allegations against my daughter. I agreed to go on the record with my real name, to be photographed and quoted directly, to risk whatever remained of my privacy in exchange for the opportunity to set the record straight. The article, titled "Local Nurse Wins $2.1 Million in Landmark Elder Abuse Case," appeared on the front page of the Tribune's Sunday edition. It included a detailed account of Allison's attempts to gain control of my assets, the legal battle that resulted in damages being awarded, and the systematic financial exploitation that had been documented in court proceedings. But more importantly, it included my own words about why I had chosen to fight back, rather than accept continued abuse. I spent 40 years as a nurse, caring for other people and advocating for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves. When I realized that my own family was exploiting me the same way some families exploit vulnerable patients, I knew I had to apply the same standards to my personal life that I had always applied to my professional responsibilities. No one deserves to be abused, regardless of their age or their relationship to the abuser. The article also included comment from Judge Morrison about the significance of the case. Elder financial abuse is one of the fastest-growing crimes in America, and family members are often the perpetrators. Mrs. O'Connor's willingness to pursue legal remedies, despite the personal cost, sends an important message that this behavior has consequences and that victims have the right to defend themselves regardless of family pressure to remain silent. The response to the article was immediate and overwhelming. My phone rang constantly with calls from people who had read the story and wanted to share their own experiences with family financial exploitation. Many were other elderly parents who had been systematically drained by adult children who saw them as sources of funding rather than human beings deserving of respect and consideration. But there were also calls from people who wanted to apologize for believing the false stories that had been circulated about my mental state and character. Mrs. Patterson from the grocery store left a message expressing regret for her cold treatment and inviting me to lunch so she could hear my side of the story. The director of the food bank called to reinstate my volunteer position and to ask if I would be willing to speak to other volunteers about recognizing signs of financial abuse among the elderly clients we served. Most importantly, the article brought me a flood of support from people who understood what it meant to stand up to family members who prioritize their financial interests over basic human decency. Letters arrived from adult children who had witnessed similar abuse of their grandparents, from professionals who worked with elder abuse victims, from advocates who recognized the courage required to fight back against people who are supposed to love and protect you. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from Maya, who called me the day after the article appeared with excitement and pride in her voice. "Grandma, everyone at school saw the newspaper article about you. Mrs. Johnson, my English teacher, read part of it to our class because we're studying about people who stand up for what's right. She said you were brave and that you should be proud of yourself for not letting anyone treat you badly." The validation from my granddaughter, from someone whose opinion mattered more to me than public recognition or legal victories, confirmed that I had made the right choice in fighting back. I hadn't just protected my own financial assets. I had modeled for Maya what it looks like when a woman refuses to accept abuse and demands to be treated with dignity and respect. The newspaper article also served as a kind of public declaration of independence from the family dynamics that had trapped me for years. By telling my story in such a public forum, I was making it clear that I was no longer willing to keep family secrets that protected my abusers at my own expense. I was no longer concerned about maintaining relationships with people who saw me as an asset to be exploited rather than a person to be loved. The freedom that came with that realization was intoxicating. For the first time in decades, I could make decisions based on my own needs and desires, rather than on other people's expectations and demands. I could spend money on things that brought me joy instead of solving other people's crises. I could travel, explore new interests, invest in relationships with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. With the court-ordered damages providing financial security I hadn't experienced in years, I began planning changes that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. I booked a trip to Ireland, something I had dreamed about since childhood, but had never been able to afford after decades of giving my discretionary income to family members who viewed my generosity as an entitlement rather than a gift. I also enrolled in a watercolor painting class at the community college, rediscovering an artistic interest I had abandoned when I became consumed with other people's needs and problems. The act of creating something beautiful purely for my own enjoyment felt revolutionary after years of viewing my time and resources as belonging primarily to others. But the most significant change was in my relationships with the people who remained in my life. I began cultivating friendships based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than obligation and guilt. I spent time with neighbors who enjoyed my company, with former colleagues who valued my professional expertise and personal wisdom, with fellow survivors who understood my journey toward independence and self-advocacy. My relationship with Maya became deeper and more meaningful as I was able to offer her my attention and emotional energy without being constantly drained by other family members' demands and crises. We took art classes together, visited museums, explored Chicago's neighborhoods and cultural attractions. I was finally able to be the grandmother I had always wanted to be, present, engaged, and focused on her needs and interests, rather than distracted by adult family members who required constant management and financial support. The months following my legal victory and public vindication brought a sense of peace I hadn't experienced since childhood. I woke each morning without the weight of dread that had characterized my life for years, without wondering what crisis or demand would consume my day, without feeling guilty for wanting to use my own time and resources for my own benefit. The city sounds outside my window, the L train, the buses, the street vendors and pedestrians, no longer sounded like reminders of a world that was moving forward without me. Instead, they sounded like invitations to participate, to engage, to explore possibilities that extended beyond the narrow role of family caretaker and financial provider that had defined my existence for so long. I began taking walks along Lake Michigan, watching the sailboats and joggers and families enjoying the lakefront parks that had been part of Chicago's landscape throughout my adult life, but that I had rarely had time to appreciate. The sight of the city skyline reflecting in the water reminded me that I was part of something larger than my family's problems and financial needs, that I had value and purpose that extended beyond my usefulness to people who had taken my love for granted. One evening in late spring, as I sat on a park bench watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, I received a phone call that confirmed how dramatically my life had changed. It was from a nonprofit organization that worked with elder abuse survivors, asking if I would be willing to speak at their annual conference about my experience fighting back against family financial exploitation. "Your case has become very well known in our community," the director explained. "Judge Morrison's decision is being cited in other cases across the state, and your public comments have inspired other victims to come forward and seek legal help. We think your story could encourage people who are still trapped in abusive situations to understand that they have options and that they don't have to accept continued exploitation." The invitation to become an advocate for other survivors felt like the final piece of my transformation. Instead of being defined as a victim of family abuse, I was being recognized as someone whose resistance and recovery could help others facing similar situations. My pain and struggle had produced something valuable, not just personal liberation, but a template that others could follow toward their own freedom and dignity. I accepted the speaking invitation and began preparing remarks that would help other elderly parents understand the difference between normal family financial support and systematic exploitation. I wanted to share the warning signs I had missed, the legal resources I had discovered, the emotional strategies that had helped me rebuild my self-worth after years of being treated as a convenient source of funding rather than a person deserving of respect and consideration. But I also wanted to address the guilt and fear that kept many elder abuse victims trapped in destructive relationships. The hardest part, I plan to tell my audience, isn't recognizing that you're being exploited. The hardest part is accepting that people you love are capable of treating you as a means to an end, rather than someone whose welfare matters to them. My speech would also emphasize that fighting back doesn't require becoming bitter or vindictive toward family members who have caused harm. I don't hate my daughter, I would explain. I pity her, because she will have to live with the knowledge that she tried to steal from the woman who gave her everything. But I also won't pretend that her behavior was acceptable just because she's family. Love doesn't require accepting abuse, and family relationships don't exempt people from basic standards of honesty and respect. The conference was scheduled for September, which gave me several months to refine my presentation and to continue documenting my recovery process. I wanted to be able to tell other survivors not just about the legal victory I had achieved, but about the personal transformation that had followed. The ways in which standing up for myself had opened up possibilities I hadn't imagined during the years when I was focused entirely on other people's needs and problems. As summer progressed, I received occasional updates about Allison's situation through mutual acquaintances and through Maya, who continued to have contact with her aunt despite the family conflict. The court-ordered damages had indeed created serious financial problems for her law practice, forcing her to take out loans and restructure her business operations. Several clients had terminated their relationships with her after learning about the elder abuse case, and she was struggling to maintain the professional image that had been so important to her identity and earning potential. Part of me felt sad about her difficulties, because they represented the consequences of choices she had made and the destruction of potential she had possessed. But I also recognized that those consequences were not my responsibility to fix. I had given her every opportunity to build a healthy relationship with me, had supplied financial support for her education and career development, had offered forgiveness for previous instances of manipulation and disrespect. Her decision to escalate our conflicts into legal warfare and public character assassination had been hers alone, and the results were the natural outcome of that strategy. More importantly, her continued struggles served as confirmation that my decision to fight back had been necessary and appropriate. Someone who was genuinely concerned about my welfare would have accepted the court's decision with grace and used it as an opportunity to reflect on their behavior and make amends. Someone who was motivated primarily by greed and entitlement would respond exactly as Allison had responded, with anger, retaliation, and continued attempts to portray herself as the victim of my unreasonable expectations. The contrast between her response and Maya's response to our changed family dynamics also highlighted the difference between people who love genuinely and people who love conditionally. Maya had been initially confused and upset by the family conflict, but she had adapted to see me as someone who deserved to be treated with respect, rather than someone whose value was determined by her willingness to sacrifice her own interests for others' convenience. During one of our afternoon walks through Lincoln Park, Maya asked me directly about the changes in our family and my relationship with her aunt. "Grandma, do you think you and Aunt Allison will ever be friends again?" It was the kind of question that children ask when they're trying to understand adult conflicts that seem unnecessarily complicated and destructive, when they can't comprehend why people who are supposed to love each other choose to hurt each other instead. "I don't know, sweetheart," I replied honestly. "That would depend on whether your aunt is willing to acknowledge that she made some very serious mistakes and to change the way she treats me. Right now, she seems to think that everything that happened was my fault for defending myself instead of just letting her take whatever she wanted." Maya was quiet for several minutes, processing this information in the thoughtful way that characterized her approach to difficult topics. Finally, she said, "I think you did the right thing, Grandma. In school, we learn that bullies don't stop bullying until someone stands up to them. It sounds like Aunt Allison was being a bully, and you had to stand up to her." The simplicity and accuracy of her analysis reminded me why children often understand family dynamics more clearly than adults who are invested in maintaining comfortable illusions about relationships that have become toxic and destructive. Maya could see the situation without the emotional complications that had kept me trapped for years in patterns of giving and forgiving that enabled continued abuse. Her support also gave me confidence that my decision to fight back had indeed modeled appropriate behavior for the next generation of women in our family. Instead of teaching her that love requires accepting mistreatment, I had demonstrated that self-respect and healthy boundaries are essential components of any genuine relationship. Instead of showing her that women should sacrifice their own welfare for family harmony, I had illustrated that women have the right to demand fair treatment and to pursue legal remedies when that treatment is denied. As the first anniversary of my court victory approached, I reflected on the changes that had transformed not just my external circumstances, but my internal sense of identity and worth. The woman who had once defined herself primarily in relation to other people's needs and expectations had evolved into someone who understood her own value and was willing to protect it against all forms of exploitation and abuse. The house that had nearly been stolen from me had become a true sanctuary, a space where I could pursue my own interests and welcome people who appreciated my company rather than my financial resources. I had redecorated several rooms, replacing furniture that held painful memories with pieces that reflected my personal taste and style. I had converted the spare bedroom into an art studio where I could paint and pursue creative projects that brought me joy and satisfaction. The financial security that had been restored through legal action gave me options I hadn't possessed in years. I could afford medical care that addressed not just immediate health problems, but preventive measures that would allow me to maintain my independence for as long as possible. I could invest in travel, education, and experiences that enriched my life, rather than depleting my resources to solve other people's problems. But the most significant change was in my relationships with the people who had earned the right to be part of my life. I had learned the difference between love that demands sacrifice without reciprocity and love that offers mutual support and genuine concern for everyone's welfare. I had discovered that respect must be earned rather than assumed, that family relationships require the same standards of honesty and consideration as any other important connections. My support group at the community center had become a source of both giving and receiving, a place where I could share my experience and strength with other survivors while continuing to learn from their insights and perspectives. Dr. Chen had invited me to co-facilitate some of the sessions, recognizing that my combination of personal experience with recovery and professional background in healthcare gave me unique qualifications for helping other elder abuse victims understand their options and rebuild their lives. The speaking engagements that had resulted from my public story were becoming a regular part of my schedule, taking me to conferences and workshops throughout the Midwest, where I could share strategies for recognizing and responding to family financial exploitation. Each presentation brought me into contact with other survivors whose stories reinforced my conviction that fighting back against abuse is both necessary and possible, regardless of the personal cost or family pressure to remain silent. But perhaps the most meaningful validation of my choices came through an unexpected reunion with colleagues from my nursing career. Dr. Martinez, who had been chief of staff at Mercy Hospital during my final years there, contacted me after reading about my case in a medical journal article about elder abuse prevention. "Helen, I always knew you were someone who would advocate fiercely for vulnerable patients," he told me during our lunch meeting downtown. "I'm not surprised that you found the strength to advocate just as fiercely for yourself when you became the vulnerable one. Your case is being discussed in our ethics committee as an example of how healthcare professionals can use their skills and knowledge to protect themselves and other elderly people from family exploitation." His recognition that my professional training had been essential to my ability to fight back effectively helped me understand that my career had prepared me for this battle in ways I hadn't initially realized. The critical thinking skills, the ability to assess situations objectively, the experience of standing up to people in authority positions who were making poor decisions, all of these capabilities had served me well when I needed to challenge my daughter's attempted theft and the legal system's initial willingness to enable it. The lunch with Dr. Martinez also connected me with other healthcare professionals who were developing educational programs about elder abuse recognition and prevention. They invited me to contribute to training materials that would help nurses, social workers, and physicians identify signs of financial exploitation among their elderly patients and understand the resources available for intervention and support. Working on these educational initiatives gave me a sense of purpose that extended far beyond my personal recovery. Instead of simply healing from my own experience of abuse, I was helping to create systems that might prevent other elderly people from experiencing similar exploitation, or that might help them respond more quickly and effectively when abuse was discovered. The project also reminded me that my professional identity hadn't ended when I retired from hospital nursing. My decades of healthcare experience remained valuable resources that could be applied to new challenges and opportunities. Instead of seeing retirement as an ending, I was beginning to understand it as a transition to different kinds of meaningful work that drew on everything I had learned throughout my career. As autumn arrived in Chicago, painting the trees along my street in brilliant golds and reds, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me from victim to survivor to advocate. The year that had begun with the devastating discovery of my daughter's betrayal had evolved into a period of personal transformation and renewed purpose that exceeded anything I could have imagined during the darkest moments of that initial crisis. The court date that had once terrified me, the moment when Judge Morrison read the decision that validated my claims and awarded damages, now seemed like a birth rather than a battle, the beginning of a new life rather than the end of old relationships. The money that had been returned to me was important, but the dignity and self-respect that had been restored were priceless. I had learned that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, never too late to demand fair treatment, never too late to discover strength you didn't know you possessed. I had proven that love doesn't require accepting abuse, that family relationships must meet the same standards of respect and honesty as any other important connections. that people who exploit others forfeit their right to continued access and support. But I had also learned that recovery from abuse is an ongoing process, rather than a single moment of victory. There were still days when I felt sad about the relationships that had been damaged or destroyed by my decision to fight back. There were moments when I wondered whether there might have been other ways to address the exploitation that could have preserved family connections while still protecting my interests. Dr. Chen helped me understand that these feelings were normal and healthy, rather than signs that I had made wrong choices. Grief for the relationships you hope to have is part of healing from the relationships you actually had, she explained. It's appropriate to mourn the loss of your dreams about your daughter, while also celebrating the reality of your freedom from continued abuse. Her wisdom helped me find peace with the ambiguous losses that had accompanied my legal victories. I could be sad about Allison's choices and their consequences while still being proud of my own courage in standing up to her manipulation. I could regret the family conflicts that had affected innocent people like Maya, while still recognizing that those conflicts were the inevitable result of years of exploitation that had been allowed to continue unchecked. The anniversary of Judge Morrison's decision fell on a crisp October morning that reminded me of the day I had first discovered Allison's legal petition in my neighbor's misdelivered mail. But instead of the despair and confusion I had felt that previous autumn, I experienced profound gratitude for the accident that had revealed the truth about my situation, in time for me to mount an effective defense. I marked the anniversary by visiting the courtroom where my transformation had been legally recognized and officially validated. The building looked the same, but I was a completely different person from the frightened, isolated woman who had walked into Judge Morrison's courtroom 12 months earlier. I had been someone who apologized for having needs and who accepted responsibility for other people's problems. I had become someone who insisted on fair treatment and who understood the difference between helping others and enabling their exploitation of me. Walking through downtown Chicago that morning, I felt a connection to the city that had been my home for half a century, but that I had rarely had time to really appreciate during the years when I was consumed with other people's crises. The buildings and streets and lake views that had been the backdrop to my working life now seemed like stage sets for a different kind of performance. The story of a woman who had learned to value herself enough to demand respect from everyone in her life. I stopped for coffee at a small cafe near the courthouse, sitting by the window and watching the morning rush of people heading to work with purpose and determination. Many of them were probably dealing with their own family conflicts, their own struggles to balance generosity with self-protection, their own questions about when love becomes exploitation and support becomes enabling, but they were also part of a community that had supported my fight for justice and dignity. The newspaper readers who had responded positively to my story, the conference attendees who had thanked me for speaking about my experience, the healthcare colleagues who had welcomed my contributions to elder abuse prevention programs, all of these connections had replaced the toxic family relationships that had drained my energy and resources for so many years. As I sat in that cafe, surrounded by strangers who were living their own complex lives with grace and determination, I felt a sense of belonging to something larger than my individual struggles and victories. I was part of a community of survivors who refused to accept abuse, of advocates who worked to protect vulnerable people, of professionals who used their skills and knowledge to create positive change in the world. The phone call that interrupted my morning reflection came from an unexpected source. Marcus, Allison's husband, whose gambling debts I had paid off years earlier with money I couldn't afford to lose. His voice was hesitant and ashamed in a way that suggested he was calling without his wife's knowledge or approval. "Helen, I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from," he began, "but I needed to call and apologize for my role in what happened to you. I've been thinking about everything that went down over the past year, and I realized that I was just as responsible as Allison for putting financial pressure on you that wasn't fair or appropriate." His unexpected apology caught me off guard, because I had written him off as someone who was too selfish and immature to take responsibility for his actions. Throughout the legal proceedings, he had remained in the background, allowing Allison to take the lead in defending their exploitation of my resources, while benefiting from the money they had extracted from my savings and investment accounts. I want you to know that the gambling problem was real and it was serious, but that doesn't excuse the way we kept coming to you for bailouts instead of dealing with the underlying issues. he continued. We turned you into our personal bank, and we justified it by telling ourselves that you were wealthy enough to afford it, and that we would pay you back eventually. But the truth is, we never had realistic plans for repayment, and we never really considered the impact on your financial security. His honesty was both refreshing and painful, because it confirmed what I had suspected, but had been afraid to acknowledge during the years when I was still hoping that their promises of repayment were genuine. They had never intended to restore the money they had taken from me. They had viewed my resources as an inheritance they were entitled to access early, rather than loans that created actual obligations for future repayment. Marcus, I appreciate your apology, I told him. It takes courage to admit mistakes, especially mistakes that have caused serious harm to someone else. But I need you to understand that the apology, while meaningful to me personally, doesn't change the legal and financial consequences of the choices you and Allison made. I understand that, he replied. And I'm not calling to ask you to drop the lawsuit or to forgive the court judgment. I'm calling because I wanted you to know that at least one person in this family recognizes that what we did to you was wrong, and that your decision to fight back was completely justified. His acknowledgement of my right to defend myself was something I hadn't received from any other family member, and it provided a kind of closure I hadn't expected to achieve. Even if Allison never apologized or took responsibility for her actions, at least one person who had participated in my exploitation understood the moral and legal implications of their behavior. But Marcus's call also raised questions about whether there might be possibilities for partial reconciliation with some family members, whether my insistence on justice and respect might eventually create space for healthier relationships with people who were willing to acknowledge past mistakes and commit to different behavior in the future. I spent the rest of that anniversary morning walking along the lakefront, thinking about forgiveness and accountability, about the difference between excusing harmful behavior and creating opportunities for people to demonstrate genuine change. The court victory had established legal consequences for financial abuse, but the emotional and relational healing would be a longer and more complex process. The conversation with Dr. Chen during my next support group session helped me understand that reconciliation, if it happened at all, would need to be based on demonstrated change rather than verbal apologies. Actions over time are the only reliable indicator of whether someone has truly learned from their mistakes, she explained. People who have exploited family members often become very skilled at saying the right words when they face consequences. But real change requires consistent behavior over extended periods. Her guidance helped me maintain appropriate boundaries while remaining open to the possibility that some family members might eventually earn their way back into my life through genuine transformation of their attitudes and actions. I didn't need to close the door permanently on all family relationships, but I also didn't need to accept empty promises or surface-level apologies that weren't backed up by concrete changes in behavior. The winter months that followed my anniversary brought a sense of settled peace that I hadn't experienced since childhood. My daily routines were structured around my own needs and preferences rather than other people's crises and demands. I woke each morning without anxiety about what financial emergency might consume my day, without the emotional weight of managing relationships that required constant sacrifice without reciprocal consideration. My art classes had progressed to the point where I was creating paintings that genuinely pleased me, landscapes and still life compositions that captured moods and moments I wanted to preserve. The creative process had become a form of meditation, a way of focusing my attention on beauty and possibility rather than on problems and conflicts. The volunteering I had resumed at the food bank had evolved into a leadership role where I could train other volunteers to recognize signs of elder abuse among the clients we served. My nursing background and personal experience with financial exploitation made me particularly effective at identifying elderly people who might be at risk and connecting them with appropriate resources for protection and support. The speaking engagements that had grown out of my public story were taking me to new cities and regions where I could share my experience with diverse audiences of survivors, advocates, and professionals. Each presentation taught me something new about the prevalence of elder abuse and the various forms it could take, while also reinforcing my conviction that fighting back was both possible and necessary. But the most meaningful aspect of my transformed life was the relationship I was building with Maya, who was now 13 and beginning to understand adult relationships and family dynamics with increasing sophistication. Our weekly outings and regular phone calls had become opportunities for me to share the wisdom I had gained through my experience while learning from her perspectives on fairness, integrity, and healthy boundaries. During one of our walks through the Art Institute, she asked me a question that revealed how much she had absorbed from observing our family's conflicts and their resolution. "Grandma, do you think there's a difference between being mean to someone and just not letting them be mean to you?" The question demonstrated her understanding that my response to Allison's exploitation hadn't been motivated by cruelty or revenge, but by self-protection and appropriate limit setting. She could see that standing up to a bully required strength and determination that might appear aggressive to people who were invested in maintaining the status quo, but that wasn't the same as becoming a bully yourself. "That's exactly right, sweetheart," I told her. "Being mean means trying to hurt someone just because you can, or because it makes you feel powerful. Not letting someone be mean to you means protecting yourself and making sure you're treated with respect. Sometimes protecting yourself might make the other person angry, but that doesn't make it wrong." Our conversation reminded me that one of the most important outcomes of my legal victory was the example it had set for Maya about women's rights and responsibilities in relationships. Instead of learning that love requires accepting mistreatment, she was developing an understanding that healthy relationships are based on mutual respect and that people who can't provide that respect don't deserve continued access to your time, energy, or resources. As spring returned to Chicago, bringing the familiar cycle of renewal and growth that had marked my years in this city, I received news that brought my transformation full circle. Dr. Martinez contacted me to announce that Mercy Hospital was establishing an elder abuse prevention program in the emergency department, and they wanted to hire me as a part-time consultant to help develop protocols and train staff. "Your combination of clinical experience and personal insight into elder abuse makes you uniquely qualified for this position," he explained. "We're seeing more and more cases of elderly patients who are being financially exploited by family members, but our staff doesn't always know how to recognize the signs or how to connect patients with appropriate resources. The opportunity to return to professional healthcare work, focused specifically on preventing the kind of exploitation I had experienced, felt like the perfect synthesis of my past career and my current advocacy efforts. I would be using everything I had learned as a nurse and as a survivor to help other vulnerable elderly people avoid or escape from situations similar to what I had endured. Accepting the position also represented a form of professional vindication that complemented the legal victory I had achieved in court. Instead of being seen as someone whose judgment was questionable or whose mental capacity was declining, I was being recognized as someone whose experience and expertise were valuable resources for addressing important healthcare challenges. The first training session I conducted for emergency department staff was both nerve-wracking and exhilarating because it required me to synthesize my personal story with clinical best practices in a way that would be useful for healthcare professionals who might be encountering elder abuse for the first time. Family financial exploitation often presents as medical neglect or delayed treatment, I explained to the group of nurses, physicians, and social workers who had gathered for the training. When elderly patients arrive with untreated conditions that should have been addressed weeks or months earlier, it's worth asking whether financial abuse might be preventing them from accessing appropriate care. I shared the warning signs I wished I had recognized earlier in my own situation. Adult children who insisted on controlling their parents' medical appointments, families who seemed more concerned about preserving inheritance than ensuring appropriate care, elderly patients who appeared nervous or fearful when discussing their financial situations. But I also emphasized that intervention required sensitivity and skill, because elderly people who are being exploited often protect their abusers out of shame, fear, or misguided loyalty. The goal isn't to destroy family relationships, I explained. The goal is to ensure that elderly patients have access to resources and support that allow them to make informed decisions about their own care and safety. The positive response to the training program confirmed that my experience had indeed produced expertise that could benefit others facing similar challenges. Hospital administrators began inviting me to present to other departments and to contribute to policy development that would improve the hospital's overall response to elder abuse cases. The success of the hospital program also led to invitations from other healthcare organizations throughout the Chicago area, creating opportunities to reach wider audiences of professionals who worked with elderly populations. Each presentation refined my understanding of how personal experience could be translated into practical guidance that might prevent other families from experiencing the kind of crisis that had nearly destroyed my financial security and emotional well-being. But perhaps the most gratifying aspect of my new consulting work was the opportunity to meet with elderly patients who were currently experiencing financial exploitation and to help them understand their options for protection and recovery. These one-on-one consultations allowed me to provide the kind of support and validation I had needed during my own crisis, while connecting vulnerable patients with legal and social services that could address their specific situations. One case that particularly resonated with me involved an 80-year-old woman whose grandson had been systematically draining her checking account through online transfers while she recovered from hip replacement surgery. Like me, she had discovered the theft accidentally and was struggling with guilt about pursuing legal action against a family member she loved. I keep thinking that maybe I should just accept it as the cost of helping him get back on his feet, she told me during our consultation. He's had some problems with drugs, and maybe this is just his way of asking for help. Her words could have come directly from my own mouth during the months when I was trying to rationalize Allison's financial exploitation as misguided concern rather than deliberate theft. I recognized the familiar pattern of self-blame and false responsibility that kept elder abuse victims trapped in destructive situations. Love doesn't require letting people steal from you, I told her gently, and helping someone doesn't mean allowing them to destroy your financial security. If your grandson needs help with addiction or other problems, there are appropriate ways to provide that support. Taking your money without permission isn't help. It's theft. The conversation reminded me of how far I had traveled from the woman who had once accepted financial exploitation as the price of maintaining family relationships. I could now see clearly the difference between helping others and enabling their harmful behavior, between love and manipulation, between family loyalty and financial abuse. Summer brought the 2-year anniversary of the day I had received Allison's legal petition attempting to steal my house, and I marked the occasion by hosting a small celebration for the friends and colleagues who had supported my fight for justice and dignity. The guest list included Mrs. Rodriguez, Dr. Chen, Mr. Ramirez, several members of my support group, and Maya, who had become my closest family ally and strongest source of encouragement. As I looked around my living room at people who had earned the right to be present for this milestone, I felt profound gratitude for the community that had emerged from the ashes of my toxic family relationships. These were people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide, who celebrated my victories without expecting to benefit from them, who offered support without strings attached or hidden agendas. Maya, now 14 and increasingly sophisticated in her understanding of adult relationships, offered a toast that captured the significance of the transformation we were celebrating. To Grandma, who taught me that standing up for yourself isn't mean, it's necessary, and that sometimes the people who really love you are the ones who support you when you're fighting for what's right, even when it's hard. Her words reminded me that the most important legacy of my legal victory wasn't the money I had recovered, or the professional recognition I had gained, but the example I had set for the next generation of women in my family. Maya would grow up understanding that love requires mutual respect, that boundaries are essential for healthy relationships, and that people who exploit others forfeit their right to continued access and support. The evening also provided an opportunity to reflect on the broader changes that my case had helped generate in Chicago's legal and healthcare communities. Judge Morrison's decision had been cited in several subsequent elder abuse cases, establishing precedents that made it easier for other victims to pursue legal remedies. The hospital training programs I had developed were being adopted by other healthcare systems, creating more widespread recognition of family financial exploitation as a serious medical and social problem. But beyond these institutional changes, I had received countless letters and emails from other elder abuse survivors who had been inspired by my story to take action in their own situations. Some had pursued legal remedies similar to mine, while others had used different strategies to establish boundaries and protect their resources. All of them had found the courage to stop accepting abuse as the price of maintaining family relationships. One letter that particularly moved me came from a woman in Milwaukee, whose situation had been remarkably similar to mine. Reading about your case in the newspaper gave me the strength to hire a lawyer and fight back against my son, who was trying to take control of my assets through a guardianship petition. I thought I was too old and too weak to defend myself, but your example showed me that it's never too late to demand respect and fair treatment. Her success, and the success of other survivors who had followed similar paths, confirmed that my decision to go public with my story had created benefits that extended far beyond my personal recovery. The precedents established by my case, both legal and social, were helping other vulnerable elderly people understand their options and find the resources they needed to protect themselves from family exploitation. As Autumn returned to Chicago for the third time since my transformation began, I received a phone call that brought the most unexpected and meaningful closure to my journey. It was from Allison, calling for the first time since the bitter conversation immediately following the court decision. Her voice was different, smaller, less confident, without the aggressive defensiveness that had characterized our previous interactions. "Mom, I've been in therapy for the past year, working on some issues that became clear to me after everything that happened between us," she began. "I'm calling to apologize, but also to acknowledge that I understand why you might not want to hear from me." The humility in her tone was something I had never heard from her before, and it suggested that she might finally be ready for the kind of honest conversation we had never been able to have during the years when she was exploiting me financially and emotionally. "I've come to understand that what I did to you wasn't protection or help. It was theft disguised as concern," she continued. "I convinced myself that I was acting in your best interests, but the truth is that I was acting in my own interests and using legal language to justify taking things that didn't belong to me." Her acknowledgement of the truth about her motivations was both painful and liberating to hear, because it confirmed what I had known but had been afraid to articulate during the years when I was still hoping that her behavior was motivated by misguided love rather than calculated greed. "I also understand now that your decision to fight back legally wasn't revenge or vindictiveness. It was self-protection from someone who was systematically exploiting your generosity and love," she said. "I put you in an impossible position where you had to choose between defending yourself and maintaining our relationship, and then I blamed you for making the only rational choice available to you." The apology she was offering was fundamentally different from Marcus's earlier expression of regret, because it demonstrated understanding not just of her own actions, but of my responses to those actions. She was taking responsibility not only for the financial exploitation, but for creating a dynamic that had forced me to choose between my relationship with her and my own dignity and security. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she concluded, "and I don't expect you to want to rebuild our relationship, but I needed you to know that I understand what I did wrong, and that I'm committed to becoming someone who is capable of loving you the way you deserve to be loved all along." The conversation lasted only 10 minutes, but it represented the kind of accountability and genuine remorse that I had hoped for, but never expected to receive. Allison was finally acknowledging the reality of her actions and their impact on me, without making excuses or trying to minimize the harm she had caused. Her apology didn't undo the damage that had been done, and it didn't automatically restore our relationship to any kind of functional status. But it did provide the acknowledgement of truth and responsibility that had been missing from all our previous interactions, and it opened the possibility that future conversations might be based on honesty rather than manipulation. More importantly, it confirmed that my decision to fight back had been not only legally and financially successful, but had also created the conditions necessary for genuine accountability and potential healing. By refusing to accept continued abuse, by demanding respect and fair treatment, I had forced a confrontation with reality that had ultimately led to the kind of honest recognition that makes real change possible. The months that followed Allison's apology brought gradual, cautious progress toward a different kind of relationship. Not the mother-daughter connection I had hoped for during her childhood, but an adult relationship based on mutual respect and clear boundaries. We began having monthly phone conversations that focused on current events and shared interests, rather than financial needs or family obligations. She never asked me for money, never suggested that I should modify the court judgment or reduce the financial consequences of her previous exploitation. Instead, she shared updates about her efforts to rebuild her law practice through ethical means and to address the personal issues that had contributed to her willingness to exploit family relationships for financial gain. The progress was slow and sometimes uncertain, because rebuilding trust after such serious betrayal is a complex process that requires consistent demonstration of changed behavior over extended periods. But it was progress nonetheless, and it represented something I had never thought possible during the darkest months of our legal battle. Maya's response to her aunt's attempted reconciliation provided important perspective on the changes that had occurred in our family dynamics. "I'm glad Aunt Allison is finally being honest about what she did wrong," she told me during one of our regular conversations. "But I'm also proud of you for not just accepting her apology and pretending like everything is okay now. Real forgiveness means she has to work to earn back your trust, not just say the right words." Her understanding of accountability and healthy relationship dynamics confirmed that my decision to fight for respect and fair treatment had indeed provided valuable lessons for the next generation. Maya was learning that love requires mutual consideration, that trust must be earned through actions rather than words, and that people who cause serious harm must take responsibility for repairing that harm, rather than expecting automatic forgiveness. As I approached the 5th anniversary of the day I had first discovered Allison's legal petition, I reflected on the journey that had transformed me from a victim of family financial exploitation to an advocate for elder abuse prevention and a consultant specializing in healthcare responses to financial exploitation. The woman who had once defined herself primarily through her usefulness to others had become someone who understood her own value and insisted that others recognize it as well. The financial security that had been restored through legal action had provided independence and options I hadn't possessed in years. But more importantly, it had represented validation that my life and welfare mattered, that I deserved to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of my age or family relationships. The money was significant, but the recognition of my worth as a human being was priceless. The professional opportunities that had emerged from my experience, the hospital consulting, the training programs, the speaking engagements, had given me a sense of purpose and accomplishment that extended well beyond personal recovery. I was using my experience to help other vulnerable elderly people avoid exploitation, to educate healthcare professionals about recognizing and responding to elder abuse, and to advocate for legal and social changes that would better protect aging Americans from family financial exploitation. But perhaps most importantly, I had learned that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, never too late to demand fair treatment, never too late to discover strength you didn't know you possessed. The transformation from victim to survivor to advocate had required courage, determination, and the willingness to risk comfortable illusions for uncomfortable truths, but it had ultimately led to a life of greater authenticity, dignity, and purpose than I had experienced in decades. The support community that had emerged around my recovery, friends, colleagues, fellow survivors, advocates, had replaced the toxic family relationships that had drained my energy and resources for so many years with connections based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine care for each other's welfare. These relationships required no financial sacrifice, demanded no emotional manipulation, offered no hidden agendas or ulterior motives. As I sat in my living room on that autumn evening, surrounded by photographs that now represented genuine love rather than obligatory family connections, I felt a profound sense of peace and gratitude for the journey that had brought me from desperation to empowerment. The woman looking back at me from those recent pictures was someone I respected and admired, someone who had faced a crisis that could have destroyed her, and had instead used it as an opportunity for transformation and growth. The phone calls from other elder abuse survivors continued to arrive regularly, People who had read about my case or heard my presentations and were seeking guidance about their own situations. Each conversation reminded me that my experience had produced wisdom and expertise that could help others navigate similar challenges, that my pain and struggle had generated something valuable that extended beyond my personal recovery. Have you ever lived through something like this? Have you ever discovered that people you trusted were systematically exploiting your generosity and love? Have you ever faced the choice between defending yourself and maintaining relationships with people who refuse to treat you with basic respect and consideration? I invite you to share your story in the comments below, because stories like these need to be told and heard. They remind us that elder abuse is not just a statistic or a social problem. It's a personal tragedy that affects real people with real feelings and real rights to dignity and fair treatment. If this story resonated with you, if it helped you understand your own situation or gave you courage to take action in your own life, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps me continue sharing these experiences and advocating for other vulnerable elderly people who deserve better treatment from their families and their communities. Together, we can create a world where aging with dignity is not just a hope, but an expectation, where elder abuse has real consequences, and where people like us find the strength to stand up for ourselves, no matter how difficult that fight might be. Thank you for listening, and remember, you are never too old to demand respect, and it's never too late to reclaim your worth.